Thank you very much for being on this special episode 7 of our defense podcast, Control Alt Defense. We're deviating ever so slightly into the country's biggest story right now, the Air India Flight 171 tragedy. There are many technological things to talk about, and as you know, if you've been watching this podcast, we do delve into those issues very deeply. But Vishnu and I today have decided to not do pure defense today, but we both felt, as people invested in issues of aviation, in issues of aircraft, as people who've tracked airlines and aviation for a very long time, we thought it was an important time to devote some attention to a complex issue, Vishnu. This is a serious and
Very
sad
sad
time.
one as well. Yeah, it is.
And we obviously start this episode by, extending our deepest condolences to all of the families of the affected, both in the aircraft, on the ground, and across countries, really. And it's a sad time. And Vishnu, I know you've covered many of these air tragedies and disasters. I know for a fact that you covered the Charkhi Dadri disaster as well. Many decades ago. Today we're talking about this, Vishnu, because at the time we are recording this episode, the black box of flight AI 171 has been retrieved from the tail section of the aircraft. Complex issue because that is going to be key to the analysis of why this aircraft crashed. There are those two, horrifying videos of the actual crash that took place. But let's start by, acknowledging that a crash investigation is a complicated, oftentimes a very meticulous and painstaking exercise. This time, hopefully things will happen a little sooner. But with the black box being recovered, let's first break down the components. What's inside the black box, Vishnu?
So the black box, firstly, is not black.
Yeah.
The black box is either pink or it's orangish in color, and there's a reason for that. It has to be reflective. It has to be something which investigators can actually see. It catches their eye. It's
Amidst
designed
all
to
the
do
debris.
that amidst all the debris. Number one. So it's not a black box. It's anything but black. There are two components primarily of a black box. There is a DFDR, which is a digital flight data recorder, and then there is a cockpit voice recorder or a CVR. These two components are located very close to each other, and in the case of the Boeing 787, they are located in the tail segment of the aircraft in an enclosed space which is hardened to ensure that the DFDR and the CVR, in other words, the black box, survives a crash.
Right.
That's the basis of it. And I can talk more if you like about it.
No, absolutely.
It's likely to be a Honeywell system in the 787, right? And these two systems, when they work together in modern aircraft, in simple terms, are almost plug and play.
Yeah.
This is solid state recording, equipment, which it's essentially a sophisticated hard drive.
Yeah.
Separate ones, one for the audio conversations between the pilots.
Yeah.
That's the
I'll
CVR,
come into the separate aspects
the
of
other
each
one
in
for
just
the
a
data.
moment. But
Yeah.
you've spoken about where these are situated.
Yeah.
And as we saw, the tail section of the aircraft was completely destroyed.
Yes.
The tail section, one part of it near intact was, on the roof. And in fact, as we speak, we understand that those, squads on the roof are trying to shift that away from there for more forensic examination. Let's go one by one in those two components that you just named. The DFDR, which stands for Digital Flight Data Recorder. That is where all, criteria, measurements, performance of the aircraft, I'm assuming all of that on a second-by-second basis across the duration of this flight. And this flight lasted 32 seconds.
That's it,
Vishnu. From takeoff till impact was 32 seconds. So I'm assuming that 32 seconds of flight data will be in that recorder?
Much more than that, in fact. Firstly,
Including from the ground.
if you look at the cockpit voice recorder, I'll talk about the DFDR also.
Okay. Yeah.
It could be, depending on the exact variant of the Honeywell system used on this aircraft, be recording the cockpit voice conversation for a period of 2 hours, after which it auto-deletes, and then it starts recording again. But if there's another more sophisticated variant, which I believe is the case, then it would be 25 plus hours of their conversations which are recorded of pilots and then scrubbed over. In terms of the DFDR, or the Digital Flight Data Recorder, it records, as I understand it, more than 1,000 parameters on every aspect of the flight. So, for example, what we can establish in this case is that there was a loss of thrust
Yeah.
in the engines, the Gen X engines on board, the General Electric engines on board this aircraft, each developing 70,000 pounds of thrust. Mysteriously, there appears to have been no thrust coming out of either of those engines, or even if there was, it wasn't enough, obviously, to sustain flight. Why is that the case? The DFDR is going to have details about that, second by second data about the where exactly the thrust lever of the aircraft was, how much the fuel consumption at that particular point was, the actual airspeed corresponding to the position of the thrust levers at that stage, where exactly they may have been
1,000
in the runway,
criteria.
right? Upwards of 1,000 criteria. And I'm just talking about the throttle quadrant at this stage, and I'm talking about the performance of the engine. There's the entire performance of the fuel flow that it'll be looking at. They'll be looking at the overall hydraulic systems, of which there are dozens of specific hydraulic systems. Why is that important? Because it's the hydraulic system on this fly-by-wire aircraft. I'll also talk about fly-by-wire platforms, but it's the hydraulic system on this fly-by-wire aircraft which has a role in the performance of the flaps.
Okay.
Why is this important? Because the flaps are important surfaces on the wings of the aircraft, and this determines the performance of the aircraft during its landing or its takeoff. And there is speculation, fairly intense speculation, on the basis of the photographs and the videos which have emerged, that the flap configuration wasn't necessarily in a takeoff configuration. In other words, if it was retracted, and if that was the case, and it was potentially a single engine takeoff because there was a problem with the other engine, then that could have been a contributing factor, if not the factor, which resulted in a crash. Again, we're just putting out what others have said. This is not definitive by any means.
So,
and so many other parameters, Shiv.
Yeah, okay. We'll talk about a few of those parameters because, for the purposes of this quick discussion on the black box since its recovery, those might actually be key to analyzing what may have happened. But I want to quickly talk about the cockpit voice recorder for a moment. We know for a fact that a Mayday call went out approximately 18 seconds after liftoff.
Yep.
And after that, there was a call from the air traffic control, but there was no response from the flight's cockpit for reasons that may not be difficult to understand. But the cockpit voice recorder, Vishnu, will have all cockpit communications as an audio file on the black box, on the CVR, which investigators can now listen to.
You know why I'm looking at my phone? Because I think it is interesting. When the initial press release came out, there was information from government sources which indicated that the pilot had said Mayday, which indicates a dire emergency on the aircraft. But given the fact that there was only 32 odd seconds that the plane was in the air, that's all that they could communicate. In a situation like that, remember, for all pilots across all aircraft, the role is to aviate, communicate, and then navigate. Aviate, navigate, and then communicate. The last thing you do is communicate. Why? Because your priority is to fly the thing.
Fly the plane,
you talk
steady
later
the
on.
plane,
In a situation like that, 30 seconds, the plane has stopped flying, it's stalling at that juncture. You're trying to fix things. You don't have to go beyond Mayday.
It stopped climbing and it's,
However, there is the spectator index, which is often very reliable in terms of news, which says that they have got information saying that the pilot said more than Mayday. What did the pilot say? Mayday, no thrust, losing power, unable to lift. That's a reasonably long statement for pilots in that situation, but perhaps one of the pilots did say that. Now, if that is the case, then you're talking about the CVR, the cockpit voice recorder, that would be in that. And if this is true, right, it clearly establishes that the pilots did not have power on the engines. Why, they do not know. We are losing power. That also establishes that there was power, but it's coming down. There obviously was power, because as that plane barreled down the runway to a speed of approximately 174 knots, right, it was okay. They crossed that decision point, which is called V1. They rotated
up
over
until
there.
that point, everything was okay.
It took off. Shiv, the plane took off. And then there was a catastrophic loss of power, presumably on both engines. And if it was just one engine, then we're looking at a one-engine scenario where the plane hasn't climbed out. Why is it not climbed out? Again, could it be because of improper flap configuration? The cockpit voice recorder will record the conversation between the pilots. Now, that is a critical part of it. But many of our viewers will say that, that's it. That's the key point that we want. No, in fact, the DFDR, the Digital Flight Data Recorder, has a lot more in terms of data, which would be far more definitive than what the pilots in the cockpit are saying. Why? because the pilots may be thinking something, but if the aircraft is performing in a particular way or malfunctioning in a particular way, what they're communicating may not be what's happening to the aircraft. So if there are errors in the aircraft from multiple systems, I've just named a few of them. The electrical systems, for example, could easily be involved in something like this. Those are data points and error messages which are recorded in the DFDR. It's just downloaded.
Yeah.
And I just hope and pray, Shiv, that it's not damaged.
Yeah.
Because there are protocols and ways to ensure that data can still be retrieved from a damaged DFDR, but and black box as it were. But I just hope that that's not the case.
Yeah, I hope so too. And what gives me hope in this is, if you remember the 2009 Air France crash, Flight 447 in the Atlantic.
Months,
There
right?
was months. I think it was actually a year or so later that submarines found the black box.
Miraculously.
About 6 kilometers deep, and they had a full picture of what happened in that terrifying flight. Vishnu, there are, key parts of the aircraft that will, tell a large part of this story.
Yeah.
The engines are most certainly going to be one of them. I'm guessing control surfaces, some of the other things you talked about as well. If there are 1,000 criteria, airspeed, angle of attack, all of these things that are recorded down to the minutest details, second by second, a digital map for investigators that they are potentially looking at even as we speak right now, because I'm assuming, without trying to simplify things, that a black box is ultimately a sort of plug-and-play device.
Yeah, it is a plug-and-play device. Assuming it's working.
Which means, assuming it's working, which means, give us a sense of what the black box would tell investigators about the engines, for instance.
It would tell you where, at the exact point at which it started not thrusting.
Yeah.
Right? Was it one engine or was it both engines? Was there, the application of the thrust levers, whether they were, equal, whether there was differentiated thrust which was actually being applied. That would seem odd, perhaps not applicable in this case because the plane was sort of flying directly. Did the pilots, when power started going down or at any stage of the flight, apply toga, or that's to go around power, or maximum power? Because remember, in several cases, you do not necessarily take off with maximum power. The management system of the aircraft, in order for airlines to ensure that fuel is saved, take into account the weight of the aircraft, the runway conditions, the temperature, which has a huge bearing on the performance of the aircraft, and offers an optimal solution whereby you can actually use thrust only to a certain extent, save fuel in the process, and take off safely. But in a scenario like that, and we don't know what mode the pilots were actually using, if there is any problem which takes place, all you need to do is either push a button on the throttle quadrant or just slam it, right, all the way down for an instant delivery of power. It's not quite instant. In the case of jet engines, it takes a couple of seconds for this to spool up, unlike propeller-driven and turboprop aircraft, where the availability of power is much more instant. So this is a factor in jet engines we need to take into account.
Am I right in saying, when we watch that, that CCTV video of the entire sequence of takeoff and crash, the point at which the engines are clearly failing to lift the aircraft and it starts to sort of level out and then descend.
It comes down like this,
The question I want to ask you is, am I right in saying that with black box data, DFDR and CVR data, investigators for the first time don't just have a unidimensional video of what happened, but they get to juxtapose that video now with all of these multiple layers of data. When those engines were failing or appearing to not provide enough thrust, they get to see what airspeed was, they get to see what was happening in the cockpit, they can listen to it. The black box will tell them about angle of attack, altitude, and all manner of other things that are not visible in that video.
It'll be much simpler than that in this particular case in terms of primary information, because if it's not simpler, then we'll talk about the next scenario, which gets far more grim, not just for Indian aviation, but Dreamliner operators around the world. If it is a simple scenario, what are we looking at to clear errors? Was there an improper application of the flaps? Was it not in a correct flap setting, right? If it wasn't a correct flap setting, then why is it that the aircraft didn't climb? Would that therefore mean that there was a twin engine out scenario? Why would there ever be a twin engine out scenario on an aircraft which has fantastic engines? There's never been a fatal accident ever before.
Yeah, this was the first accident of
Was
the
there?
787.
That's right. Was there a scenario where, for example, there was a single engine which went out for whatever the reason that may have been there, and in a scenario like that, instead of switching off the malfunctioning engine, one of the pilots accidentally switched off the functioning engine. There have been crashes which have happened in
There
the
are
past
some experts who
because
said
of that.
it's a possibility.
All right, so that's another factor that you're looking at. There are a couple of other scenarios as well, but I think you will know this instantly and start ruling out what has not taken place. What was the rate of fuel flow? Was there a horrific problem in the fuel system of the aircraft? There is also this entire business about contamination of fuel, which I don't think would necessarily be something which would be of concern, because there are other aircraft as well at that airport which have landed, taken off from there as well. Fuel is tested in terms of its quality before each and every flight, but perhaps there would be parameters on the rate of fuel flow. That's something that they'd want to know. And of course, the flap setting, which I've already discussed. There's one more factor, Shiv, and just before you come in. When an aircraft takes off and it is in a single engine configuration, so you've lost one engine, it's hot, you are a fully loaded aircraft, what you do is you retract the undercarriage, you raise the undercarriage. Why? You want to make the aircraft more responsive, more aerodynamic in that situation. But rather than retract the undercarriage or raise the undercarriage, has there been a mistake where the flaps have in fact been retracted instead? This is hypothetical, we don't know any better. This is what the digital flight data record will instantly tell you.
So I'm glad you mentioned that, because that comes to one of my final points on this quick discussion, which is that the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder, and more the DFDR, will be able to pinpoint and separate the idea of technical faults, mechanical faults, machines being the reason, and what
Pilot
you're
error?
suggesting, which is pilot error.
Yeah, it could well be both.
It can be a combination of both.
100%.
But the black box will be able to
It'll
situate
tell you
that.
everything that went wrong. And then researchers go through the data and they come out with a conclusion. Now, here's the second part, which I was referring to earlier on, and we need to mention it. The world of Dreamliner operators, there are more than 1,000 Dreamliners out there, are looking, I think it's more than 1,000, I stand corrected.
1,116 aircraft flying right now.
Dreamliners?
Yeah, Dreamliners.
Great. More than 1,000 Dreamliners in the world, every single operator waiting to see if there is a larger concern on the Dreamliner or whether this is an Air India specific problem related to this particular aircraft. Because if there is a larger problem, then you know what that means. It means that there is a potential of Dreamliners elsewhere in the world being grounded. We've seen that in the case of the Boeing 737 MAX 8 aircraft, when of course there was a massive design failure associated with a separate system which pilots were not trained adequately to deal with, the MCAS system. Won't talk about that on this particular episode. But the Dreamliner hasn't had any such problems. I mean, they've had problems with their lithium-ion battery earlier on in the day. It was a battery which was being developed in Japan. But then to ensure the safety of that battery, because they needed a certain power, they needed the battery to generate a certain, given the electrical systems on board, a certain wattage. So they had a fairly large battery, potentially combustible. It was put into a strengthened structure, and that's what airlines around the world. Apart from that, there have not really been too many problems per se. There have been concerns about construction qualities on the aircraft. In one of the two Boeing plants, there was a documentary which actually came out. But no, there has not been any fatal crash so far. But if there is something, right, which the DFDR and the CVR doesn't turn up with, that's when we get into a scenario where not just Air India fleets get grounded, but potentially, you get an international fleet grounding, which means that international civil aviation is going to be massively hit.
Last two questions, Vishnu. People often wonder, in this hyper-connected age that we live in, why can't live data of aircraft performance be beamed back to airlines or to operators?
It can.
Or to airports? Why don't all aircraft have it? Explain that then.
There's a system called ACARS, which is what this particular aircraft is equipped with. And all day through the day, I've been reaching out to Air India and I've been asking whether the ACARS, which is essentially a communication system on aircraft such as the Boeing 787,
That's streaming live data.
and the 78 and the 777 as well, whether it has been configured to relay on a real-time basis information on key flight parameters, including potential errors that the flight is throwing up on a real-time basis to Air India ground engineers and potentially to Boeing, the manufacturer of this aircraft as well, on a real-time basis. Because if that
in the
is the
interest
case,
of safety, right?
pretty much, I mean 100%.
Yeah.
If that is the case, right, and if Air India does have ACARS configured in this manner through what I believe to be a paid service, then Air India, moments after the crash, minutes after the crash, potentially Boeing also, minutes after the crash, would know what the error messages were and they would get a lead into what caused the crash. Obviously, it doesn't have a fraction of the data of the DFDR,
The actual black box, yeah.
right? But you would know. You really would.
That brings me to my last question on this episode, which is the black box is there in the hands of investigators. They probably plugged it in and looking at all the data coming out
Right now, Shiv. Yeah.
Between now and the first levels of clarity as to what may have happened, how long does this analysis take? Or does it vary depending on what happens?
It completely varies. But they would get a preliminary idea of whether there is an obvious reason why this has taken place, a straightforward case of pilot error, a straightforward case of a mechanical problem in the aircraft, that rare scenario of a twin engine out, right? They would know whether that's taken place or not. But the underlying, and this is where a lot of these crash reports, which I read all of them from around the world when I can, the underlying reasons often point to more than one factor.
Yeah.
A crash, Shiv, isn't why did the plane crash? The engine shut down. No. Why did the plane crash? The pilot made an error. A crash report goes into several circumstances. There is always more than one factor. There is a sequence of events. If it's a pilot error, how was the pilot trained? When was the pilot requalified? Was he or she requalified? How were they assessed? How did they do their simulator sessions? What were the simulator sessions in which they did well and they didn't do well? What is the psychological evaluation of this particular pilot? How have they risen up the structure within the airline? Were they cleared for command? Were they cleared for a particular post? How many hours do they have on the type? What is the manner in which they fly the aircraft? Have they done any hard landings? I can think of so many things. That's the pilot part of it.
Yeah.
There'd be many more factors as far as the mechanical. I mean, there are millions of parts on an aircraft like this.
Well,
so, all of that data would need to come out.
Very true, and it has begun.
That's where it takes time, Shiv, in terms of the report actually coming out.
Yeah.
Saying that, okay, we have the broad idea, but we have to, in our report, state the underlying reasons which have caused the crash, because it's only once you do that and you are duly diligent in coming out with the report that you prevent something, there's a learning experience, not just for your airline and your crew, whatever it is, but for airlines around the world.
The terrible loss of this tragedy is something that the families, the country, the aviation world is going to be dealing with for a very long time. The damage is done, the loss is irretrievable, Vishnu. And as we end this episode, let's only hope that the investigation is a quick one. There can be clarity, there can be closure. Transparency as well, because this is not just any crash. This is a crash that literally has international ramifications for civil aviation here in India, and we all know how civil aviation has been struggling post-COVID as well to make a comeback. But the hard questions need to be asked and answered, and we will continue to do that here on this podcast on NDTV as well. So Vishnu, this has been very illuminating, and Vishnu and I and our team will be continuing to shine the light on some of these more complex issues as we and a country begin one of the most complex, potentially, aircraft accident investigations. Thanks for watching.
Thank you very much.